Mr. Speaker, where is the love? We want to talk to you about selling love, why selling romance can be very beneficial to people, why it actually allows them to discover themselves in a meaningful way, which isn't just banging some hoe's head off a headboard and calling her a slut really loudly, because we don't think that's always beneficial as the only way to discover your sexuality, perhaps. We want to talk about access to sexuality and why we believe this is a negative proposition. Thirdly, we want to talk about how we believe it actually goes against positive discussion of sexuality and the consequences arising from that in society in general. And finally, I want to talk about the modification of self-perception that's brought about by this proposition. Getting right into it, rebuttal will be integrated. The idea of selling love and why we think this can be beneficial. We say firstly that people always learn things, like in the modern world, about their sexuality through the media. They've accepted that on their proposition by saying, for example, things like advertising have an effect, right? And we would also add to this, as we said in the point of information, things like art, any sort of media interaction that we have. However, we have two options here today. We can go along with the prop, where you're left in a situation where the only way to access your sexuality through the media is in a way that's devoid of feeling, or way that's devoid of emotion, or interact with any kind of meaningful personal or emotional interaction with another person. It's something that's purely sexual, something that's purely urge of flesh, and there's nothing more to it than that. We think that's massively problematic. We say that on our side of the house, we give you a much rosier alternative. We give you an option to actually have that interaction, have that feeling. See people interacting with each other in something like a film about people's relationships, which can definitely be expected to arouse viewers, which can definitely have this effect on those individuals who choose to consume it. But furthermore, under our side, we get to see often what happens in the aftermath, because it's not purely a bedroom scene, ladies and gentlemen. No, it's so much more than that. We say that, for example, like that falling into bed with someone can either result in you never wanting to talk to them again, or very different circumstances. And I wouldn't say the previous thing from personal experience, leading to very different circumstances, where perhaps you want to spend the rest of your life with that person. We think that when you actually consider what these scenarios can produce for the individual, you get far more beneficial discourse in society and people thinking about this. In terms of sexual awakening, we think it's a much better idea that people are able to experience this in a gentle way as part of the world around them, and not something that's distinct and separate and something which should be taboo and kept in a dark room, because we haven't been told why it should be so on proposition. We don't see that there's any reason why it would. In fact, we think it's very harmful when you have to see this as an entirely separate part of your life. In terms of this false corporate state distinction, they just assume that because you're the state, you have better incentives or something like that. We point you to things like the Dove campaign for real beauty, ladies and gentlemen, a massive corporation which try to promote a different type of beauty. We think that that's absolutely laudable and something which shows that this idea about corporate incentives is just rubbish. In terms of people accessing their sexuality and why we think our side is comparatively more advantageous. No, thank you. We think that what this proposition does is it makes sex and sexuality and sexual orientation and gender taboo, right? We think that's massively problematic because it makes it something that's a distinct and separate part of your being, which we say it's not. We say what it actually does is it impinges on your ability to ever embrace your sexuality. Christine gives you the point of information about things like new art, actually empowering people to discuss different practices, discuss what their sexuality means to them and how it engages with other aspects of their life. No, thank you. What this proposition does is it makes that discovery scary. It says that you have to go to places that you would never otherwise have to go in order to get this information, in order to discover your sexuality. It forces you into back alleys to sex shops, with all the taboo that surrounds that in society when somebody sees you walking down that back alley and into that sex shop. When you go online, no thank you, in your basement and have to discover it this way. We say there's a number of things. Firstly, you do so alone in your basement. You think that you're the only person that ever has to undergo this, that doesn't understand it automatically. You assume that everybody else doesn't face the same difficulties that you do. And we think that's massively harmful to the individual. Secondly, you feel dirty. No thank you. You see, if you see an 18s movie which has a storyline around it, which has a whole host of real life scenarios in it, you can see that sexuality is part of that person's life. But when it's something that's solely about sex, you see that something is dirty and has to be kept in the bedroom. No thank you. Thirdly, we said disadvantages lots of groups, particularly we're going to focus on females for this bit of analysis. Firstly, because those are people who access porn less on average, and we think that's massively harmful to those people in terms of discovering their sexuality because they're now placed at a disadvantage. Secondly, we say that in the massive majority of cases, porn does objectify women. This is just factually true, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of, in terms of like women never actually getting to choose to embrace their sexuality, we say that's problematic too. Because like you now, in order to embrace your sexuality as a woman, you have to act like a porn star and not like Keira Knightley. We say that's massively damaging. And I'll take opening in a moment. And finally, in terms of like where educational shortfall exists, you now, like we said, that people don't generally compensate by going to these like sites and shops, and we think that's massively harmful because you basically lose this ability for people to be educated simply by being in a mainstream society. That's something that they never address. People who aren't otherwise educated get a kind of organic education, if you will, simply from being in a liberal society. So,
if people were so able to rationally respond to this sexual imagery, why were people so offended when the all-common Koch worlds put exotic female dancers on the stage and offended them with that display of intimacy?
Well, I was still in school, firstly. I think perhaps because people don't necessarily consent into things like that, that's fine. Because we think that you have things like watersheds under the status quo, you have like movie ratings, you can choose to watch an 18s movie or not, right? So we don't see how that stands. Moving into like this idea of positive discussion, we think that what happens here is like that you don't ever, like a feature of repressive society is that you don't ever get to talk about sex with other people. You don't ever get to discuss sexual practices or things that you might want to talk about. So we think like what this leads to is a situation where dominant forces within society, therefore, such as the church, get to dictate that discourse. Why is that harmful? Firstly, they have no mandate from the people. They're just people who happen to have organically risen to power, or because they happen to have more money, for example. But secondly, they get to use like their social power, things like we have God on our side to dictate your views. We say that that's massively harmful to those individuals. Furthermore, that hurts minorities, because minorities obviously are the ones who don't control the majority discourse, Mr. Speaker, because that's massively harmful to gay people in countries where the Catholic Church was dominant, for example. So we think that's all very problematic. Finally, then this thing of like this idea like of a public-private distinction which they paint, which we say is ridiculous, because they try to divorce what you consume in public from how you treat sex in private. We said you can't. They create a situation where when you're doing things in the bedroom, you're being a slut, and a public display of affection is something that's entirely divorced and separate from that. They never explain that distinction to you, Mr. Speaker, because we believe that sex isn't divorced from love, isn't divorced from society, because we believe that sexual expression can be a force for good in society and in public. We're proud to oppose.